Hi, I'm Mina.
And I'm Yules.
Thanks for tuning in to Artificially Informed.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today's Friday, February 20th, 2026. And I have to be honest with you. I spent last night reading through the massive stack of reports you sent over, and I had this distinct feeling of vertigo.
Vertigo. That is an interesting word for a news cycle. Usually people just say exhaustion.
No, it really wasn't exhaustion. It was vertigo. Because usually we are looking at one specific timeline for you guys. We do a politics dive or, a tech dive. But today we have a stack that essentially breaks the timeline of reality into three distinct, completely conflicting pieces.
Right.
On one hand, we have the very loud, very immediate geopolitical drama. President Donald Trump's board of peace, the rising tensions with Iran, the stock market jittering. That feels like the now.
The immediate high-stress present. The timeline where we all live and, well, pay taxes.
Exactly. But then you buried these scientific reports right in the middle of the stack that just quietly dismantle everything I thought I knew about the history of our species and the literal composition of the planet we are standing on. And then there is a third timeline where we are seemingly inventing time crystals out of styrofoam.
It does feel like a collision of eras, doesn't it? You have the ancient past being rewritten, the laws of physics being bent, and then the very messy reality of 2026 international relations sandwiching it all together.
So here's the mission for today. We need to somehow reconcile these timelines. We need to balance the high-stakes drama from Washington to Tehran with these absolute bombshells from the scientific community. Because frankly, I think the discovery of a new ocean inside the Earth might actually be more important in the long run than who snubbed who at a diplomatic dinner in D.C.
It is a bold claim, considering the headlines, but I am inclined to agree with you. We have a massive stack today. We've got investigative reports on space disasters we didn't know were disasters, economic data that contradicts the political narrative, and archaeological finds that effectively double the timeline of human history.
So let's start right there. Let's start with the deep, deep dive. And I mean literally deep. You flagged a report from Popular Mechanics regarding a site in northern Mexico. Now, I went to school. I learned the Clovis first model.
We all did.
Right. So humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge about 13,000 years ago. They had these specific spear points. They hunted mammoths. End of story.
Yeah, that has been the dogma for the better part of a century. The Clovis point, the distinct fluted stone spear tip, was the smoking gun. We didn't find anything older, so we just assumed nothing was older. It was neat. It was tidy. It fit the timeline of the ice sheets retreating.
But this new report, it just throws that out the window.
Throws it out the window. I was putting it mildly. It shatters the window and rebuilds the house on a completely different foundation. We are talking about the Chiquihuite Cave site. This is in northern Mexico. Archaeologists have identified stone tools, nearly 2,000 of them, stratigraphically dated to approximately 30,000 years ago.
30,000, just to contextualize that for you listening, 13,000 years ago is the end of the Ice Age. 30,000 years ago is deep inside it.
It is the last glacial maximum. And this is exactly why the Clovis first proponents are so resistant to this data. 30,000 years ago, the ice sheets covering Canada and the northern United States were massive. The route from Asia into the Americas was effectively blotched by walls of ice miles high. It was an impassable barrier.
So if these people were in Mexico 30,000 years ago, how did they get there? They didn't walk through a wall of ice. Did they fly?
Unlikely. The leading theory now, and this finding essentially forces us to accept it, is the Kelp Highway. The idea is that they didn't walk through the continent, they boated around it, they hugged the Pacific coast, living off seafood, moving south, long before the interior corridor ever opened up.
But look at the tools themselves. The report notes they aren't just crude rocks. That was my first thought. Are we just looking at rocks that kind of look like tools?
That is always the criticism. People say, oh, it's just a broken rock. But no, the analysis here shows advanced knapping techniques. These were shaped with intent. They show evidence of edge trimming. And what is really fascinating is the material. They were using limestone.
Is limestone good for that?
Not really. It isn't the best material for tools, which suggests they were adapting to what was actually available in this high-altitude Mexican environment.
So these weren't just lost wanderers?
No, absolutely not. They were sophisticated survivalists. They were hunting, foraging, and navigating a landscape that was totally alien to the one the Clovis people eventually found. They were dealing with megafauna, extreme climate shifts, and they were doing it for thousands of years before we thought humans even arrived.
It really forces a re-examination of everything. I know there have been controversial sites in Texas and Idaho that people dismissed because, they couldn't be that old.
Exactly. The Galt site in Texas, the Cooper's Ferry site in Idaho. For years, archaeologists who claimed older dates were practically laughed out of the room. This Mexico finding vindicates them. It suggests that the Americas have been a home to humanity for a lot longer than the textbooks say.
Okay, so humans have been here twice as long as we thought. That changes the history of the surface. But you also included a study that claims we have been wrong about what is under the surface.
The core.
Right, we are taught the core is iron and nickel, maybe some sulfur, solid inner core, liquid outer core, simple.
That is the standard model. But geophysicists have had a problem for a long time called the density deficit.
The density deficit.
Basically, when we measure the seismic waves passing through the Earth, the earthquake echoes, so to speak, and we calculate the mass of the core based on gravity, the math doesn't quite work. The core is actually too light to be pure iron. There had to be light elements mixed in there.
Like fillers in a crab cake. You need something to fluff it up.
A crude analogy, but yes.
Yeah.
We suspected silicon, oxygen, maybe carbon. But this new study published in Popular Mechanics, referencing work from the Princeton Geosciences Department, points the finger at hydrogen.
The lightest element in the universe.
Exactly. But the headline number is what really melts your brain. They estimate there are 6 sextillion kilograms of hydrogen trapped down there.
I can't even visualize 6 sextillion. That sounds like a fake number a child would make up.
It really does. So let's use the analogy from the report. Think of the oceans. All the water in the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the ice caps, combine all of that water. This study suggests the core holds a volume of hydrogen equivalent to dozens of times the world's oceans. Some estimates say up to 45 times.
Wow, so we are sitting on a planet that is significantly wetter in a chemical sense than we ever thought.
In a sense, yes. But it isn't water as we know it. It's not sloshing around. This is where the tech comes in. How do you prove this? You can't drill to the core.
Right, the deepest we have gone is what, 12 kilometers?
Exactly. The core is thousands of kilometers down. So they use something called a diamond anvil cell. They take 2 diamonds, the hardest material we have, and squeeze a tiny sample of material between them to mimic the crushing pressure of the center of the Earth. Then they blast it with lasers to heat it up.
So they are simulating the core in a lab.
And what they found is that under those specific conditions, pressures millions of times higher than the atmosphere, hydrogen stops acting like a gas. It actually enters the iron lattice. It bonds directly with the metal.
And why does this matter to me sitting here on the crust? Does it change anything about our day-to-day?
It changes everything about how we understand the geodynamo. The outer core's movement is what generates our magnetic field. That field is the only reason you and I aren't being fried by cosmic radiation right now. It protects our atmosphere. If that core is significantly wetter or less dense than we thought, it changes the viscosity. It changes how goopy the outer core is.
Which means our models for how the magnetic field is generated and how it might flip or change need to be entirely updated.
Precisely. It fundamentally changes our model of planetary formation. It suggests the Earth trapped a massive amount of hydrogen gas from the primordial nebula during its birth. We're walking around on a hydrogen tank.
It is amazing that we are still figuring out the basic ingredients of the planet we live on. Okay, one more historical mystery before we go to space. Viking giants.
This one is straight out of a saga.
A mass grave found in Cambridge, England, 9th century CE. Popular Mechanics reported they found a skeleton that was significantly larger than the others.
Right. And context is key here. This was a time of heavy Viking activity in England, the Great Heathen Army era. Finding a mass grave implies a battle or an execution. But the size of this individual really highlights how legends start.
Because if you are a local Saxon farmer and you are used to people being maybe 5'6" or 5'7", and suddenly this guy shows up.
Exactly. The Vikings had a distinct advantage, which was nutrition. They had a very protein-rich diet. Lots of fish, dairy compared to some of the agricultural societies they raided, who relied heavily on grains. Better nutrition in childhood leads to greater height.
So the giant wasn't a monster, he was just well-fed.
Well-fed and genetically distinct. But to the person on the ground, witnessing this warrior who towers over everyone else, hacking through a shield wall, that is how you get the myths of frost giants and superhuman invaders. It grounds the mythology in biological reality.
Okay, let's leave the Earth and the core and look up. Section 2, the new space age. And honestly, reading these reports, it feels a bit like the dangerous space age.
It is certainly a reality check for the entire industry.
We have the report from NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, regarding the Boeing Starliner. This is the crewed flight test from back in 2024. Now, we all watched this happen. The mission was supposed to be a week. It lasted 93 days. We knew it was bad. But now NASA has released the official investigation, and they have classified it as a Type A mishap.
That is a very specific, very serious designation.
Unpack that for us. What does Type A mean in NASA speak?
In government speak, it sounds bureaucratic. In reality, it means there was a high risk of injury to the crew or total loss of the vehicle. It means the safety margins weren't just thin, they were practically non-existent.
The report details hardware failures that sound terrifying, specifically the thrusters.
The doghouse thrusters. The investigation found that the Teflon seals, which are used to keep the helium lines tight to grated, they heated up, extruded, which basically means they melted and stretched and clogged the propellant lines.
Teflon, like on a non-stick pan?
Similar material, different application. But imagine that gunk choking the engine of your car while you were driving on the highway. Now imagine doing that while trying to dock with a space station moving at 17,500 miles per hour.
And the report says they actually knew about leaks before launch.
That is the damning part. They identified a helium leak, they analyzed it and decided it was stable. This speaks directly to the leadership deficits mentioned in the report.
It feels like a culture clash. You have Boeing, a commercial entity on a fixed-price contract, trying to get the job done, and you have NASA trying to maintain safety standards.
That is exactly it. In a fixed-price contract, if you delay, you lose money. If you have to redesign, you lose money. So there's an immense pressure to fly as is if the risk seems manageable. This report is a stark reminder that in aerospace, a manageable risk can turn into catastrophic failure in a split second.
It really highlights that even for a giant like Boeing, space is hard. And it is a reminder that as we push for this commercial space era, we can't just assume it is like catching a flight to London.
No, absolutely not. And the fact that corrective actions are only being taken now, retroactively, shows how deep these systemic issues were. It is a sobering read for anyone expecting space tourism to be routine anytime soon.
Speaking of space tourism and commercial space, SpaceX, BBC and States.com noted they just landed a rocket in the Bahamas for the second time, which looked cool on the live stream. But there is a darker cloud here, literally.
Yes, a fascinating and slightly worrying study. Researchers have, for the first time, measured air pollution from a re-entering rocket in real time.
And what did they find?
Lithium, a massive plume of it.
Lithium, like in batteries.
Exactly. This was from a Falcon 9 crash. But the data applies to re-entries in general. When these massive metal objects burn up in the upper atmosphere or when the second stages deorbit, they don't just disappear, they vaporize.
And we have no idea what that does to the upper atmosphere, do we?
Not really. The concern is the ozone layer and also the thermal balance of the atmosphere. We are talking about injecting metals into a part of the sky, the mesosphere, that is usually pristine.
There's an irony here. We are mining lithium on Earth to build electric cars to save the environment. And then we are shooting rockets full of lithium into space, which might be damaging the environment from the top down.
It is the paradox of the new space age. We want reusable rockets, we want global internet via Starlink, we want to go to Mars. But the launch cadence is increasing exponentially. SpaceX wants to launch hundreds of times a year. This isn't just a one-off event anymore. It is a new type of industrial pollution.
It seems like the first step towards sustainable space travel is simply admitting that there is pollution.
Exactly. You can't regulate what you can't measure. Now we can measure it.
Well, while we are looking at the atmosphere, let's look at Uranus. Space.com is reporting that the James Webb Space Telescope, JWST, has done it again.
This is a beautiful piece of science.
They mapped the auroras of Uranus in 3D.
For the first time, Uranus is an oddball. It spins on its side. Its magnetic field is tilted and chaotic. So its auroras, the northern and southern lights, aren't nice, neat rings like on Earth or Saturn. They are messy, shifting, complex structures.
And JWST was able to visualize how solar ultraviolet light hits that tilted field.
Right, and why does this matter? Because ice giants, like Uranus and Neptune, are actually the most common type of planet we find around other stars. Understanding Uranus helps us understand the atmospheric physics of thousands of exoplanets. It is a local lab for a galactic phenomenon.
From the edges of the solar system, let's come back to Earth, and specifically to the chips that are powering our computers. Section 3, Technology Frontiers.
The PAC silica.
I love that name. PAC silica, the piece of silicon. Sources from India Today and Al Jazeera are reporting that India has officially joined this U.S.-led initiative.
This is a major geopolitical alignment. The goal is securing supply chains for critical minerals and artificial intelligence.
It is the realization that you can't have AI without the chips, and you can't have chips without the minerals.
Exactly. It is the new oil. And the subtext here, which isn't very subtle, is countering Chinese dominance. China controls a vast amount of the processing for rare earth minerals.
So the U.S. and India are teaming up, which makes sense. India has the labor and the market. The U.S. has the intellectual property and the capital.
It creates a friendshoring network. Instead of relying on a rival, you rely on a strategic partner. It secures the intelligence of the future so it isn't beholden to Beijing.
And amidst all this trade talk, we have Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, sounding the alarm again.
He is calling for urgent global regulation. He is warning about safety and democratization.
It feels like he is saying, we are building a race car, and we need you to build the guardrails before we hit 200 miles per hour.
Or before the car decides where it wants to go. It is interesting to see the creators of the tech pleading for the government to step in. Usually, tech companies want the government to stay away. This shows you how high they actually think the stakes are.
Right, but while we are building AI, physicists are apparently breaking the laws of time, or at least bending them. Topic B, time crystals.
This is one of those concepts that hurts your brain if you think about it too hard.
Popular Mechanics says they made them using styrofoam.
Which sounds ridiculous, but yes. Okay, let's try to explain this. A normal crystal, like a diamond or a quartz, has a pattern that repeats in space. Atom, 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 in a nice line.
Got it. Structure in space.
A time crystal is a structure that repeats a pattern in time. It flips states back and forth without consuming energy in a repeating loop.
So it is like Jell-O that jiggles forever without anyone touching it.
Huh. That is actually not a bad analogy. It is a system that moves between two states without losing energy to heat. It breaks what we call time translation symmetry.
And using styrofoam, specifically modifying the molecular structure with lasers, they have managed to create this effect in a way that is more accessible than super-cooled quantum computers.
Right. Previously, you needed absolute zero temperatures and millions of dollars of equipment. If we could do this with modified polymers, it opens the door to practical applications.
And the application, is this just a cool parlor trick for physicists?
For now, it is mostly theory. But it paves the way for advanced acoustic technologies, better sensors, and potentially quantum memory. It is essentially rewriting our understanding of phase states of matter.
We are rewriting history with the Mexican tools and rewriting physics with time crystals. I love it. But now we have to look at the map. Section 4, Geopolitics, the Trump era 2.0 landscape.
This is where things get volatile, and where we have to be very precise about what is happening versus what people are saying is happening.
Let's start with the big event in Washington, the Board of Peace.
President Donald Trump's signature foreign policy initiative for the Middle East.
He launched it yesterday. The pledge is huge. $10 billion for Gaza reconstruction. $7 billion of that is already confirmed from members.
It is an ambitious number. But look at the composition of the board. Trump has secured commitments from Indonesia and Morocco to send troops or aid.
That feels incredibly significant. Indonesia is the largest Muslim-majority country in the world.
Exactly. Bringing them in is a strategic move. It changes the optics completely. If U.S. troops go into Gaza, it looks like an occupation. If Indonesian and Moroccan troops go in funded by this board, it looks like an Islamic coalition stabilizing the region. It is a shrewd diplomatic play.
However, the structure of the board itself, critics are tearing it apart, specifically the veto power.
Right. Trump retains personal veto power over the board's decisions. That isn't how the UN works. That isn't how NATO works.
And that is why France rejected participation.
The French delegation essentially said, this isn't an international body, this is a subsidiary of the Trump administration. They view it as a parallel structure that undermines international law. If one man can veto the group, it's not really a group.
And then, of course, the gaffe. We can't ignore it, because it is all over the timeline. South China Morning Post, DW, they all covered it. Trump is on stage with the Paraguayan president Santiago Peña and says,
I like women, not young, handsome men.
Right. In the middle of a peace summit involving conservative religious nations?
It consumes the oxygen. Instead of analyzing the Indonesian troop deployment, which is a major shift in policy, the world press is talking about a bizarre off-script joke. It highlights the volatility of this era 2.0. You get the bold policy moves, but you also get the chaotic distractions.
Meanwhile, the Gazans themselves, quoted in the reporting, are skeptical. They call it a drop in the ocean.
They see it as a construction project rather than a political solution. The sentiment is, we'll rebuild the buildings, but we won't fix the politics. And without a path to sovereignty, $10 billion just builds nicer ruins for the next war.
Speaking of the next war, the transaction with Iran is looking much more dangerous. Topic B, the escalation.
This is the scary part of the stack.
Trump has given the world and Iran a 10-day deadline to reach a nuclear deal, or else bad things happen.
And he is backing that up with metal. U.S. carriers and aircraft are moving into the Middle East region in force.
The markets are freaking out, oil prices are surging, stocks are sliding.
Because uncertainty is the absolute enemy of money. And this is maximum uncertainty. But there is a diplomatic rift here that is very telling. The United Kingdom.
DBC reported the UK government clarified it has not given the US permission to use Royal Air Force bases for strikes on Iran.
That is a major rift in the special relationship. Usually when the U.S. moves in the Middle East, the UK is right there. For London to publicly say, count us out, shows how risky they think this strategy is. They are worried about a massive miscalculation.
It is a high-stakes poker game, but the chips are actual ships and missiles.
And the risk is that Iran doesn't fold. If they feel backed into a corner, do they accelerate their nuclear program? Do they close the Strait of Hormuz? What happens on day 11?
That is the question keeping everyone up at night. Let's move to the economy, because that is also messy. Topic C, U.S. trade.
The numbers are in for 2025, and they are not what the administration wanted.
The Washington Post noted the U.S. trade deficit hit a record $901 billion.
Nearly $1 trillion.
And this is after Trump's tariffs. The policy was supposed to fix this. The line was, tariffs will bring jobs home, reduce the deficit.
It didn't. In fact, imports surged, especially in tech.
Why?
Because the consumer drives the ship. If Americans want iPhones, cheap electronics, and fast fashion, they're going to buy them. If you put a tariff on it, the price just goes up, but the demand doesn't vanish. Or importers rush to buy before the tariffs hit, causing a massive surge.
And now the Supreme Court has entered the chat.
This is a constitutional bombshell. The Supreme Court has struck down Trump's sweeping reciprocal tariffs. They have essentially said the president cannot unilaterally rewrite trade law without Congress.
That upends his entire economic agenda.
It really does. It restores a check on executive power that has been eroding for decades. But economically, it creates chaos. Businesses don't know what the tax rate will be tomorrow, and if you are a company planning a 5-year strategy, you hate that.
Let's do a quick fire on global flashpoints before we move on. Venezuela.
Chaos. RT is reporting that interim President Delcy Rodriguez has enacted an amnesty law. This comes after, and we have to treat this as the report says, President Nicolas Maduro was abducted by U.S. forces on narco-terrorism charges.
That is a massive escalation in South America. Abducted is a strong word, but if he is in U.S. custody, that changes the whole board.
It does. It signals that the U.S. is returning to a very aggressive Monroe Doctrine policy.
Next flashpoint. India-U.S. relations. An interim trade deal operational in April.
Right. India is reducing tariffs in exchange for U.S. partnership. But friction remains because India is still purchasing Russian oil. It is a very delicate balancing act.
And Ukraine boycotting the 2026 Milan Cortina Paralympics opening ceremony in Italy because Russian and Belarusian athletes are there.
It is a reminder that the war in Ukraine is still touching everything, even international sports. There is no time out in geopolitics.
Moving to Section 5, crisis, climate, and human rights. We have to talk about Sudan.
This is a tragedy that just isn't getting enough headlines because of the noise in Washington and Tehran.
France 24 noted a UN report found hallmarks of genocide in El Fasher, Sudan.
The Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, are targeting non-Arab civilians. We are talking about mass killings, displacement, systematic starvation. It is reminiscent of Darfur in the early 2000s, but potentially worse because the state has completely collapsed since late 2025.
And with the world looking elsewhere.
Sudan is slipping into the abyss with very little international intervention. It is a moral failure of the international community, frankly, risking full-scale famine and regional instability.
It is heartbreaking. And on the environmental front, we have emergencies closer to home.
The Potomac River.
A massive sewage spill. The Washington, D.C. mayor declared a state of emergency.
It is not just gross. It is an ecosystem collapse in a major waterway. Scientists fear lasting damage. And across the Atlantic, satellite data shows European wetlands could vanish in our lifetime.
In our lifetime.
Yes, they're drying up due to changing rainfall patterns and human development. Wetlands are the kidneys of the planet. They filter water and store carbon. Losing them accelerates the climate crisis dramatically.
And back in the U.S., DW reported we have coal plants getting waivers for mercury emissions.
Mercury, a known neurotoxin,
The argument from the plants is usually economic. It costs too much to scrub the smoke.
But the cost is ultimately paid in public health, specifically brain development in children.
Yeah.
It's a trade-off, keeping the lights on cheaply versus keeping the population healthy.
It feels like we are pushing the environmental systems to the breaking point on multiple fronts simultaneously. Water, air, wetlands.
It is a systemic stress test, and the cracks are definitely showing.
Section 6, Society, Health, and Culture. Let's start with the headline that woke up the UK.
Prince Andrew. It is historic. A former prince, the king's brother, in handcuffs. The charges are related to misconduct and the Epstein ties that have dogged him for years.
And the update from the New York Times and BBC is that he has been released pending investigation, but reports say he is poverty-stricken, financially ruined.
The phrase, "how the mighty have fallen," comes to mind. But King Charles III's statement was crucial. He said the law must take its course.
He's cutting him loose.
He has to. It is a constitutional necessity. If the monarchy protects him, the monarchy falls. This is the end of the era of royal impunity. It sends a message that no title protects you from the law. It isn't just gossip. It is an institutional crisis.
It is a fascinating moment for British history. Let's pivot to something more hopeful. Health breakthroughs.
We definitely need some good news.
Alzheimer's, a new blood test.
Plasma p-tau-217. Catchy name, but an absolute game changer. It predicts symptoms years in advance. It operates as a clock model for the disease.
If you know it is coming, can you stop it?
That is the next step. But you certainly can't treat what you don't diagnose. Early detection is the holy grail of Alzheimer's research. It allows for lifestyle changes, diet, stress management, and early interventions that could slow the progression.
And a universal vaccine.
Stanford researchers. A nasal spray for all colds and flus.
Wait, like the common cold?
Yes. Pan-viral protection. If this works in humans, it changes public health forever. No more flu season, no more losing productivity to a winter cold.
That would be a miracle. And finally, UFOs.
Of course. It wouldn't be 2026 without it.
Trump has ordered the Pentagon to release the files on UFOs and aliens.
Following up on comments by Obama, Trump says he doesn't know if they are real, but wants transparency.
But the AARO report, the Pentagon's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, says no aliens.
Right. They say it's balloons, drones, optical illusions. But the order to release the raw files, that is going to ignite the internet. People are going to be combing through every redacted line.
Even if there are no aliens, the fact that the president is ordering it makes it a cultural phenomenon. Public interest is peaking.
It validates the curiosity. And who knows? Maybe in those raw files, there is something the AARO report glossed over.
So we have covered a lot today. From 30,000-year-old tools in Mexico to 6 sextillion kilograms of hydrogen in the core. From the Starliner failures to the SpaceX pollution, the geopolitical fires in Iran and Sudan, the fall of a prince.
It has been a whirlwind.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with this thought. We started with the time crystals, structures that repeat in time, and we started with the ancient tools that completely rewrote our timeline.
We're rewriting the past and reshaping our understanding of physics simultaneously.
Exactly. If history is this fluid, if we can suddenly discover we were here 15,000 years earlier than we thought, and if the future is this volatile with AI and space risks, what is the one fact you hold today that will be dust by next year?
That is a very provocative question.
To quote the figure skater Ilya Melinin from our reports, who said the person he was weeks ago is dust. Maybe our understanding of the world is just as fragile.
Stay curious, everyone. There is a lot to keep track of.
Be sure to check the show notes for the details on the Board of Peace and that full Starliner mishap report. See you in the next deep dive.
For enjoying Artificially Informed.
Hit subscribe and share it with a friend.
From the left, the right, and straight from the algorithm.
Thank you.
Welcome to the debate.
Good to be here.
We are recording this at a moment where the tectonic plates of geopolitics aren't just shifting, they are really just grinding against each other. The 2026 Munich Security Report has just dropped, and it coined a phrase that I think is going to define the rest of this year. They called it wrecking ball politics.
Yeah, it is certainly a vivid image.
It is, and it captures the central tension that we need to unpack today, because we are seeing a collision between a new style of aggressive, personality-driven diplomacy from Washington all the way to Buenos Aires, and the fragile reality of global economic stability. So the question we are asking is simple but heavy. Is this disruption a necessary demolition of a world order that was, frankly, already broken? Or is this wrecking ball just swinging out of control, threatening to smash global markets and peace? I argue for the former. The post-1945 order is dead, and this is a necessary pivot.
And I take the opposite view because we aren't asking this in the abstract, you know? As we speak, the markets are flashing red globally. Stocks are down in New York and Asia. Brent crude is surging past $70 a barrel, and the world is holding its breath over a 10-day ultimatum issued to Iran. You look at this landscape and see a painful birth of a new system. But I look at the data, the Dow dropping 430 points, the riots in Argentina, the trade deficits, and I see a fragmentation that is creating unacceptable risk for everyone involved, from the boardroom to the street corner.
I completely understand the anxiety. Transitions are messy. But let's start with that Munich security report. A lot of commentators are clutching their pearls over the term wrecking ball politics, treating it as a pejorative. I think they're missing the point. The report is essentially an obituary for the post-1945 order. The old institutions, the UN Security Council, the WTO, they're paralyzed. They are zombie structures. What we are seeing now isn't chaos for the sake of chaos. It is a pivot to reality. The report calls it issue-based cooperation. I just call it getting things done.
Right, but issue-based cooperation sounds sophisticated until you translate that for a global audience. It means international law is optional. It means we only follow the rules when they suit us. My concern is that when you take a wrecking ball to the building, you really better have a blueprint for what you're building next. And right now, I don't see a blueprint. I see a scramble.
Well, I disagree. The blueprints are there, they just look different than what we're used to. They aren't universal treaties signed by 190 countries that no one actually obeys. They are smaller, sharper, and harder. Look at the Board of Peace initiative launched by President Trump.
I was hoping we would get to the board.
It's the perfect example. Critics dismissed it as a vanity project or a parallel structure, but look at the metrics. In its very first meeting, it secured $10 billion in pledges. $7 billion of that came directly from member states. And it's not just the usual Western suspects. You have Indonesia and Morocco deeply involved. Indonesia is even discussing contributing troops for an international stabilization force. This is the Global South stepping up. This is bypassing the bureaucratic gridlock of the UN to get actual capital and boots on the ground. That is the new realism. It prioritizes results over procedure.
But can we call it a result if the foundation is rotten? You cite $10 billion. That sounds impressive, until you realize critics are already calling it a drop in the ocean compared to the actual reconstruction costs of the region. And let's look at who isn't in the room. France, a key European power, rejected participation. China, the second largest economy on Earth, is steering clear. And most importantly, the Palestinians aren't represented. They view this entire board with deep skepticism.
They're skeptical of everything right now.
With good reason. You call this bypassing gridlock, but I call it creating a club of exclusions. By sidelining the UN, you're not just cutting red tape, you're cutting out legitimacy. And without legitimacy, these solutions don't stick. Look at the immediate fallout of this diplomatic style. The Dow Jones isn't dropping because investors are excited about new realism. It's dropping because ultimatums and ad hoc alliances create unpredictability. And if there is one thing capital hates more than taxes, it's uncertainty.
The market volatility is reacting to the Iran deadline, which is a leverage play we can discuss in a moment. But I want to stick to this idea of structural change because it's happening everywhere, not just the Middle East. Look at Latin America. You have Javier Milei in Argentina. He is the absolute embodiment of this wrecking ball philosophy.
He certainly is.
He just pushed a massive labor reform bill through the lower house, 135 to 115. It was a brawl. But he is addressing an economy where 40% of the workforce is working off the books because the regulations were so stifling. Or look at Venezuela. The deadlock is broken, Maduro is out, captured in that operation, and you have the interim leadership under Delcy Rodriguez passing an amnesty law and actually engaging with foreign investment. These are massive, tangible shifts that the old diplomatic polite speak failed to achieve for 20 years.
You are describing the actions, but you are glossing over the human and economic costs. Let's look at Argentina. That labor reform didn't just happen in a parliament. It happened while general strikes were shutting down the country. Flights canceled, garbage piling up in the streets of Buenos Aires, violent clashes with police. That is instability. That is social combustion.
Is shock therapy. Sometimes the patient screams before they get better.
Or the patient dies on the table. And globally, the economic data suggests this wrecking ball is swinging back to hit the global consumer. We have a new study from the J.P. Morgan Chase Institute that creates a very ugly picture of this new realism. It revealed that tariffs paid by mid-sized U.S. companies have tripled. Tripled.
That is a specific sector, though.
It is the middle of the economy. And this isn't just an American problem. When U.S. mid-sized companies pay triple tariffs, they raise prices. That exports inflation to the rest of the world. At the same time, the U.S. trade deficit has hit a record $1.24 trillion. So, if the goal of this aggressive, protectionist nationalism was to fix the economy and bring balance, the data says it is failing. We are replacing established trade law with ad hoc tariffs, and businesses are bleeding cash because of it.
I think you are conflating the friction of transition with the failure of the policy. Of course, tariffs hurt in the short term. They are designed to force a realignment of supply chains. But let's dig deeper into these themes. I want to circle back to the Board of Peace versus traditional multilateralism, because that is where the ideological split is clearest.
Let's do it. Because from where I sit, the board looks like a lot of style over very little substance.
See, I think you are romanticizing the alternative. The UN has been paralyzed on the Gaza file for 2 years. Resolutions get vetoed, statements get watered down, and the conflict drags on. The Board of Peace brings 20 nations to the table who actually want to act. You mentioned France opted out. True. But reports indicate Russia is actually evaluating the proposal.
Which should worry you.
Why? If you want stability, you need all stakeholders. And you have Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim-majority nation, ready to put skin in the game. That gives the initiative credibility in the Islamic world that a U.S.-only mission would never have. It is an ad hoc coalition, yes, but it is functional. It is bringing new money, $10 million, to a region that is desperate for reconstruction. The UN was begging for funds and getting pennies. This board got pledges in a week.
Pledges are not cash, and acts of charity do not erase acts of exclusion. You keep saying it's functional, but let's look at the reality on the ground. You have a theoretical ceasefire, yet reports from France 24 and the South China Morning Post indicate that violence in Gaza continues. There have been hundreds of violations. The board is issuing ultimatums like this 60-day disarmament demand to Hamas, but the Palestinians aren't even at the table.
They can't be at the table until the disarmament question is settled.
That is a catch-22 that leads to war, not peace. When you impose terms rather than negotiate them, you don't get compliance, you get insurgency. And regarding the funding, critics are pointing out the vague nature of the allocation. It is a headline number without a clear infrastructure to deliver it. When you bypass the UN, you also bypass the mechanisms for accountability, for vetting, for aid distribution that have taken decades to build. You're throwing money into a vacuum and hoping it lands in the right hands. It is a high-risk gamble.
The UN mechanisms were leaking money like a sieve. That is why we needed a bypass. And regarding the ultimatum to Hamas, sometimes you need to force the issue. The initiative is forcing a conversation on disarmament that wasn't happening before. And it isn't just the board. Look at the broader security picture. The U.S. is deploying significant assets. 2 aircraft carriers, the USS Gerald R. Ford moving to the Strait of Gibraltar. It is a show of force designed to create leverage. It's the same logic applied to the Iran situation.
And that logic is terrifying the markets. That brings us to the 10 to 15 days deadline Trump issued to Iran. You call it leverage, the markets interpret it as a prelude to kinetic warfare. Brent crude is over $70 a barrel specifically because of this threat. That hits consumers globally. It drives inflation in New Delhi, in Berlin, in Cape Town. It hurts the very economic stability you claim we are trying to protect. You cannot separate the diplomatic wrecking ball from the economic fallout.
I acknowledge the volatility. It's undeniable. But let's look at the economic nationalism argument you raised earlier, specifically the trade deficit. You cited that $1.24 trillion number as proof of failure.
Because it is. Imports are surging, exports are flat. Protectionism isn't working.
The context matters. Supply chains are being rerouted, not just cut.
Yes, the JP Morgan study shows mid-sized companies are hurting from tariffs right now. That is the cost of decoupling from cheap subsidized competitors. But look at the countermoves. We have an interim trade deal with India and the US that is set to be operational by April. That was negotiated bilaterally, fast. It is designed to reduce tariffs and strengthen ties with a key strategic partner. That is the new architecture being built. It's not protectionism in isolation. It's strategic shifting of dependence.
An interim deal with India is a positive step. I will grant you that. But it doesn't offset the systemic damage of broad tariffs. The math doesn't work. The JP Morgan data is clear. The costs are being passed down to consumers. And despite all this talk of packed silica and securing supply chains, global markets remain incredibly porous. Look at Zeek.
The EV company?
Exactly. A Chinese electric vehicle company. They are about to launch sales in France. Despite all the political rhetoric about decoupling, about security risks, about tariffs, the market wants affordable electric vehicles, and Chinese companies are expanding. You can try to wall off the West, but capital and commerce are fluid like water. It finds the cracks.
But we are competing in that fluidity. We aren't just building walls. Look at the Edge AI package announced by the State Department. $200 million to boost the American smartphone industry and digital infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific. That is the U.S. putting money on the table to compete with China directly, not just with tariffs, but with investment. It is about merging national security with economic competitiveness.
$200 million is a rounding error compared to the trade deficit. It's a press release, not an industrial policy. And while we are focusing on this issue-based competition, we are ignoring the broader economic instability. Asian stocks are falling, tracking Wall Street. The nervousness in the market isn't just about one policy. It is about the unpredictability. Businesses can adapt to bad policy. They cannot adapt to chaos. And when the leader of the free world is making policy via ultimatum, that is chaos.
I think chaos is just what we call a strategy we don't understand yet. Let's look at energy security in Latin America, because this is where the 4D chess is actually visible. This is where the pragmatic brilliance of this administration is clearest.
I'm listening, but I am skeptical.
Look at Venezuela. For years, the policy was deadlock, sanctions, poverty, migration crisis. Now suddenly the board is flipped. Maduro is gone, captured in a U.S. military operation. That is a massive development. You have Delcy Rodriguez as interim president. She has already passed an amnesty law for political prisoners. She is signaling alignment with U.S. interests in the oil sector.
And you trust that signal?
It's not about trust, it's about interests. There is talk of Venezuela accessing $4.9 billion in IMF special drawing rights. For our listeners, that's essentially a liquidity injection from the International Monetary Fund. Why allow that? Because the West needs to offset the risk of Iranian oil going offline. It is a ruthless, pragmatic swap. We stabilize Venezuela to insulate ourselves from a potential Middle East shock.
Ruthless is the right word. But let's look at the reality on the ground. You have a U.S.-backed leadership change in Venezuela, which Russia is already condemning as a violation of international law. That creates a new flashpoint. And while you talk about integrating Venezuela, the energy war is happening now. Hungary and Slovakia are threatening to cut off energy to Ukraine because of the Druzhba pipeline dispute. The global energy market is a powder keg. Betting on Venezuelan oil to save us from an Iran crisis is a long-term play for a short-term emergency. It won't come online fast enough to stop the price spike we are seeing today.
It is a gamble, I admit, but look at Argentina again. You dismissed Milei earlier, but he is the poster child for this wrecking ball approach. He is slashing the old state. The labor reform bill passed. He is trying to fix a broken economy by force of will.
And he is tearing the social fabric apart to do it. You can't just look at the macroeconomic indicators. Stability isn't just about the deficit. It is about whether people can live their lives. If you force reforms that lead to mass unrest, you scare away the very foreign investment you are trying to attract. It is a self-defeating cycle. And this brings me to my deepest concern, the fragmentation of global governance,
Which the Munich Security Report calls issue-based cooperation.
They can dress it up however they want. I call it dangerous gaps or people fall through. When you move away from universal institutions like the UN to flexible alliances, who protects the vulnerable? We have a report from the Lancet suggesting the death toll in Gaza is far higher than official figures, potentially 75,000 violent deaths. Without strong, centralized monitoring, which the UN used to provide, we don't even know the scale of the tragedy. It provided the standard. Now, even the standard is gone. Look at South Sudan. The violence there is escalating, risking a new civil war, but the world is looking at Iran and the Board of Peace. The UN rights chief is warning about artificial intelligence needing global standards, but we are fracturing into competing tech blocks. Who sets the rules for AI safety in a fragmented world? If the US has one set of rules and China has another, we have no safety net.
That is a fair point. The lack of global standards for AI is a real risk. But my counterargument is that the universal institutions were failing to protect those people, or set those standards anyway. The UN didn't stop the slide in South Sudan. It didn't prevent the tragedy in Gaza. The argument of the new realism is that we stop pretending a global consensus exists where it doesn't. We build smaller, stronger coalitions, like the US-India partnership, like the Board of Peace, and we act. Middle powers like Indonesia and India are stepping up because the old superpowers are gridlocked.
But acting without legitimacy leads to more conflict. You mentioned the US-India trade deal, but you ignored that the US also just ran a record trade deficit with the world. You mentioned the Board of Peace, but you ignored that France and China are out. We are creating a world of us versus them on every single issue: trade, tech, security. That doesn't lead to stability. It leads to friction, and friction eventually leads to fire. We are seeing that smoke in the Middle East right now.
We are certainly seeing the friction, but I would argue that friction produces heat, and heat can forge something stronger. The fact that the US is finally securing its smartphone supply chain in the Indo-Pacific, or that we are finally seeing movement in Venezuela after years of stagnation, these are signs of life. The old order was a zombie. It was walking, but it wasn't doing anything. We are finally moving.
I suppose we will see if this movement drives us off a cliff. We have 10 days to see if the Iran ultimatum triggers a war that sends oil to $100 a barrel. We have mid-sized companies in the US trying to survive triple tariffs. We have Argentines in the streets. If this is the new realism, it feels incredibly dangerous.
It is dangerous, but history is rarely made safely. As we wrap up, I think we have to acknowledge that the transition we are discussing is turbulent. The market dips are real. The anxiety is real. But the shift toward bilateral accountability, whether it is the US and India or the US dealing directly with the new leadership in Venezuela, is a necessary correction. We are building a world order based on what countries actually do, not what they sign in a non-binding resolution.
And I will conclude by saying that the cost of this transition is too high. It is measurable in the trade deficit, in the inflation risk from oil prices, and in the marginalization of vulnerable populations who rely on international law. Disruption is not a strategy in itself. We are dismantling the guardrails at the exact moment, with AI, with nuclear proliferation, that we need them the most. The world is becoming more dangerous, not safer.
We can agree that the next few weeks are going to be a stress test for both of our worldviews. With the Iran deadline looming and market volatility persisting, we are about to see if the wrecking ball clears the way for something better or just leaves a pile of rubble.
Indeed. I encourage our listeners to look past the headlines and read the source material, the Munich Security Report, the economic data from JP Morgan. Don't just take our word for it.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.
That's it for today's Artificially Informed.
Nope. Thanks for spending your time with us.
Yeah.
Stay sharp, stay curious. See you next time.